presentation.
Yeah.
Yes.
I guess if I don't need to use the. Do I need to use the mic here? The big one? The wireless? Can I Actually, oh, so if I stand here, it will work. If I
With this,
stand
you
here.
can walk anywhere. Yeah.
Oh, but I have to stand here because I'm
You
just
can
going.
just use that one. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Oh, okay. Now it's because I'm just 1 minute. Probably.
You're fine. Yeah. Okay.
So, pues todos están acá ya. Ready to go. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third day of dialogues and perspectives about the Amazon. My name is Juan Carlos Galeano. I'm a teacher at FSU, and on behalf of the presenters today in Amazonia Week, I want to express our gratitude to Dr. Rainier Leshas, chair from the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics, Dean San Hakaba, and the Director of Media Communications and Marketing, Heather Athe, who is here with us today too. Thank you, Heather. Thank you for your support. Amazonia Week is comprised of engagement and discussions to raise environmental consciousness on FSU's campus and in Tallahassee. It is the environmental humanities thinking from our Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics intended as our way of academic and social intervention in the midst of climate change and an increasing destruction and degradation of ecosystems everywhere around the world. I want to thank our presenters today, graduate and undergraduate students coming from the biological, social sciences, and humanities from FSU and from UF, for dedicating this time of their lives to sharing their work and field work with us. Thank you so much again, sharing your stories about the entangled lives of the humans and non-humans in the Amazon basin. So we're gonna start with Will Boose, who is alumni from FSU just a couple of years ago, right? He went to UF and he was in our department and graduated from history with wonderful honors thesis on anacondas and capitalism, right? Yeah. And he's still in the Amazon. He's working now in a very interesting project that he's going to share with us. And you'll be graduated from UF pretty soon, right? Yeah, in May. In May, and moving to, this is in Latin American Studies?
Yes, I'll be graduating this semester Latin American Studies and then starting at Emory in the fall for anthropology.
For cultural anthropology, right? Wonderful. We are so proud of you here at FSU. All right, so he's coming to present on multimodal mobility, the motocarristas of Iquitos, Peru, through poetry, photography, and interviews. And let me say just a couple of things about you. I have your bio here, and we're good to go. Will Boose is a second-year graduate student at the University of Florida, Master's in Latin American Studies program, where he conducts ethnographic research on the labor experiences of motocarristas, or motorcycle taxi drivers in Iquitos, Peru. He explores themes such as road conditions, societal tensions, collective organizing, gender and creative expressions. His broader academic interests include infrastructure, urban Amazonia, informal transportations, and multimodal methods. Boose is also a poet, I know that, and collaborates with colleagues in Iquitos as the digital director of the poetry and literature review Sentidos, Revista Amazónica. I know that too, and I share it with my students, Will, through my class. All right, so the floor is yours.
All right, so we're going to get that pulled up there. As Dr. Galliano introduced, the theme for my presentation is going to be multimodal mobility, the motocarristas, or motorcycle taxi drivers of Iquitos, Peru, through poetry, photography, and interviews. First, I just want to say good afternoon, and we have a great group here today, so I think it'd be a shame if this wasn't at least somewhat interactive. So at the beginning here, I would like first anybody who has ever been to the Peruvian Amazon to raise their hands. You've been to the Peruvian Amazon? All right, so there's a few of us, but most have not. Cool. So there's an opportunity to share perspectives from there, and to kind of give some of the experiences that various presenters here have had in the region. Second, raise your hand if you speak and understand Spanish. Cool. That will come in handy for one of the poems. I'm not going to read all of them, but I will have one in there. And then raise your hand if you've ever heard of motorcycle taxis. Cool. That's exciting. So we're going to, actually, here, before I do this, we're going to start with a video, and I just want people here to, more than anything, listen. Obviously, like, observe what we're doing. This will kind of help set the context for what we're going to be talking about today and what motocarristas mean in Iquitos, what they look like, how they sound. At the beginning of this, just reflect on what you're hearing at the beginning of this. I think it's very interesting what this sounds like, and it might even trick you a little bit. We'll see how well we can hear it. There we go. Continues as such for another few seconds. We didn't really hear the beginning too well, but did anybody notice anything about the beginning there? Yeah.
The beginning, to me, it sounded like wind through the trees.
Yeah. So I agree with that. At the beginning, whenever it's louder, it almost sounds like somebody's playing an instrument, and then what you realize is it's actually people honking in the distance. So I think that's really interesting, just to have this like really tranquil moment of observing the traffic in Iquitos, because a lot of the time in some of this societal perceptions we'll talk on later, motocarristas are kind of described as like taking away the charm and encanto of the city. But then there's moments like this where it's like the sun is setting, it's kind of in golden hour in the city, and like you just hear the sound and everything feels really relaxed and almost pretty. So just thinking through ideas like that, I think that's a good kind of segue into this topic. So an overview of my research, I did this in the last summer, so July and August of 2019, for my master's research capstone at the University of Florida. And it's an ethnography of motocarristas' labor experiences in Iquitos, Peru. And what that means is basically observations, interviews, using different methods to portray what I've seen as their labor experiences. And it's very important to me to use multimodal methods. So I have a couple quotes down here kind of explaining why that's important to me. One is that this anthropologist Roxanne Varzi from UC Irvine argues that certain research materials demand certain modalities. Basically what they're getting at there is like if you're covering something that's a very mobile labor experience, if you're covering a mobile phenomena, your method should account for that, and it shouldn't just be like written on a page trying to portray something that's very 3D and involves a lot of movement. So some of my methods try to adjust for that as well. And then the other, this is actually an advisor I'll be working with in Emory starting in the fall, says that multimodal anthropology is where the humans are. So poetry, video, photography, those are things that people can engage with no matter what their background is. They don't have to have been within these very privileged walls of academia to understand what's going on with that, and it kind of breaks down a lot of these norms and allows for a broader and deeper conversation. So using these methods, the themes I explore, like Dr. Galliano mentioned, are infrastructure, gender, societal tensions, collective organizing, innovation, and expression. And in addition to the multimodal methods, I also use Marxist thinking on cities to approach this. And the main theoretical perspective I'm using there is from Lefebvre, who's this French Marxist philosopher, on the right to the city, which basically says or talks about the different ways that people have access to the city and also what the city looks like. Is it hyper commoditized? Is it all about markets, or is it about how people experience the city? Is it about access to spaces that bring people joy and fulfillment? And then the other underlying philosophy of my project is privileging the perspectives of the laborers who produce the city, pulling from David Harvey there. So to me and to people in Iquitos, motocarristas are incredibly important to the way that the city operates on a day-to-day basis. So through my work, I'm trying to first listen to their perspectives and then privilege those perspectives as we talk about the city. So as we go through, there's going to be a lot of photos. This one is interesting to think about how central motocarristas are in Iquitos. This was pulling up to the port of Bellavista Nanay, and immediately arriving in a boat, you can already see through the frame like 8 or 9 motocarros in the distance. Here again, you see a lot of motocarristas and motocarros in the city, parked waiting for customers, driving by a food stand there. And for people who haven't been to Iquitos, this is also a good opportunity to see what the place is like. So obviously, I have all this fun multimodal stuff, but there's also data involved. So through the interviews, collecting data, getting people's perspectives, and this just kind of shows by the numbers what the participants' labor experiences are like. So age-wise, from 23 to 65, average of 40.9. There are people younger than that working in the profession, but they're less likely to agree to an interview because they're less likely to have the documents that they need to be a motocarrista. So I just respected that, and if people didn't want to interview, that's fine. Time in profession, the earliest or least experienced was 7 months. Some have been working in it for 33 years, which is since it started in the city of Iquitos, for an average of 11.6. This hours worked weekly, that 24.5 is a major outlier. That's somebody who has a different job as their main profession, and they're actually they're working as a motocarrista on the side. I would say 60 to 84 hours per week is kind of the norm, so that's a lot of hours. Almost everybody works 7 days a week. There's only 2 participants who didn't work 7 days a week. So just think about how that kind of differs or maybe resonates with the experiences you have here. In terms of the size of their household, that ranged widely from 1 to 10 people. And then income, so I have this in soles, which is about 3.3 soles per US dollar, so you can think about this. And what I want to point out here is that for all motocarristas, the difference in their gross income and net income is huge. That's from paying gasoline costs. But then if we look at this chart here, this side is showing for those who own their vehicles, and then this side is showing for those who rent. So in addition to everybody paying this gas cost, you also have here, which is paying the daily rent cost. And then that leads us to the situation where some participants said, if you work as a renter, you live like a slave because you're paying gas, you're paying rent, and then you have to feed your family, and at the end of the day, you might have negative money. So you worked 12 hours in a day, you're going to end up with 0 or owing money. So that's not a very sustainable profession, but it is a way to make a living in the city, and that varies vastly on whether you're an owner or a renter, as that 15 soles difference, so almost $5 difference is huge in this context. This is the only poem that I'm going to read. I know that we have varying language backgrounds in this room, so I'm going to read this for everybody. If you speak or read Spanish, feel free to read it in your own voice in your head. I usually don't read my poetry out loud, so this is going to be an interesting experience for all of us, but we're going to go for it. So this is called Caldo de Gasolina, which for anybody who doesn't know basically means gasoline soup. So here we go. This is a very, unfortunately, common phenomenon in Iquitos, which I'll explain after. So, Gustavo está chupando la gasolina porque su motor ha fallado. Muchísimos motocarristas han comido este caldo de gasolina mientras los turistas que se transportan con cecina o ceviche de dorado in uno de esos restaurantes al lado del Hotel Dorado, which is now a DoubleTree, by the way. Capitalism. Anyway, Gustavo está chupando la gasolina porque su motor ha fallado, pues su motocarro está varado en el centro de la calle Mariscal Cáceres. ¿Cuál es la receta para un motocarro muerto? Chupa la gasolina, corre con tu carro y reza que no ha muerto de verdad. Evidentemente, Gustavo la chupó bien porque su motor se ha encendido de nuevo. ahorita puede conducir a su cliente el turista a su cena de cecina en unos de los restaurantes al lado del Hotel Dorado. Cuando llegue a su destino, el turista pagará a Gustavo 3 soles, mientras la cena cuesta lo que Gustavo gana en una semana. Does anybody who speaks Spanish want to explain this to somebody who does not? And like maybe just talk about your reaction to this poem? Anybody in the crowd? Yeah.
Those last two lines are really, really interesting. It's saying they pay him $3, which is going to be pretty much less than the meal that they're about to eat, and it's everything he's going to make in a week. So kind of puts everything in perspective.
Yeah. Does anybody get kind of what he's having to do here to start his car back up? Basically what happens there is like when the gas is running low and they haven't had money to pay for gas in a while, there's still a little bit of gas left in the tank, but not very much. So the car will start to fail a little bit and they can screw off the cap and then kind of like with their mouth or with their fingers like suck the gas to get it to move around a little bit, run with it and try to rev it, and then often it starts back up. So I just decided to call that gasoline soup to kind of talk about this and then compare it with a common dish, which is caldo de gallina, similar sound, and talk about that. We'll skip the rest of the poems. They're all, I can share them later for anybody who's interested, but there's like probably 5 or 6 that are pretty central to the project.
Or they can access the journal online, right?
Yeah, I'll talk about that later, yeah. So at the end, I'll have you all pull out your phones because that's going to help me and my roommate Matt out quite a bit. But we'll do that later. So getting into the first of the themes, and I'm going to cover these much more shallowly than I would like to, just for time and out of respect for the other speakers today. The first is infrastructure, so I call this engaging pavement, road conditions, and their impact on motocarristas. And basically what I'm looking at here is how the infrastructures of Iquitos, and especially the roads, impact their net earnings. So earlier I talked about gasoline costs and rent costs, but there's also repair costs. There's also physical repercussions of working in traffic and driving on roads of variable conditions. So these roads, as we'll see in pictures in a minute, both eat at the driver's body and at the bike to the extent where they have to spend a lot of their income either repairing the vehicle or taking care of their own health. So I have here road conditions lead to repair costs, which lead to financial strain, and this led participants to say, the problem is that we make no money, and we work to pay for repairs, replacements, tires, and more. So they're not working for spare income for themselves, they're working to maintain the profession and to, in a way, kind of tread water. As I mentioned, road conditions also lead to physical health problems, which again can lead to financial strain. Both of these have impact on mental health as well. And one said if you ride into Belén, which is a district in Iquitos, you feel as if you're riding on top of a horse for all the different bumps in the roads. And this, which is common in a lot of districts of Iquitos, leads to motocarristas having a higher incidence of back pain. That studies a master's project from students in Iquitos. And this leads me to talk about infrastructural violence in terms of materiality, which is incredibly common. That's a really big field of literature in anthropology and geography where people talk about the ways that road conditions or water access or things like that impact people. There's this really interesting work by Jacob Doherty, who's also an anthropologist, who talks about double infrastructural violence, he talks about how transport workers are made into infrastructure. So like think about riding in an Uber, which I'm sure most people here have probably done, or riding on a bus, or riding on any sort of public transportation. That infrastructure system is not just the road, it's that person. And in a lot of the ways society turns these laborers into part of the infrastructure, and in that process makes them invisible through how highly visible they are, also doesn't really acknowledge their labor experiences, in a way makes them disposable. And he talks about this in the context of Kenya and how there was this oil spill on a road, and instead of avoiding the area, motorcycle taxi drivers who needed gas for their vehicles actually went to try to scoop it up, and the oil caught fire and 53 of them died from direct consequence of economic instability in the way that transport workers are made disposable. So from that, I talk about this double infrastructural violence, both in the material terms that's covered very commonly, and also in the way that as perceiving people as infrastructure, you can make them disposable, which is not something you should do to any human. Thinking about the materiality, we have some photos here. So this is on the same street, both of these. So the one on the left, you can see how the driver on the right had to avoid that massive piece of concrete jutting out in the middle of the road to go on the right. The one on the left was avoiding this in the background, what has basically become a roundabout because you can't go through the middle of the intersection. that almost caused them to collide. And then the second, that manhole there is uncovered and goes like 12 feet down into the ground. So that's pretty good examples. And then here, we actually have a mixed bag of examples, and I want to stress this, not all roads in Iquitos are as beat up as some of these. Some are in pristine condition, and that leads us to the question where that is, who goes through those areas, and why it's like that. So this is in Belén. This is actually at the same place as the two that I just showed. That's a different angle there. This is more in the center, and you actually even have like this artsy stuff on the side of the road making it really pretty. Road is pristine. Meanwhile, construction in different zones of the city back in Belén, and then in the main center plaza of Iquitos, Plaza de Armas, there is pavement and not a bump or a hole in sight, which happens to be where most tourists go and do not really leave when they're in the city. Gender in the profession, this is incredibly interesting. So I should have mentioned earlier, Iquitos is a city of 500,000 people, but 30,000 of those are motocarristas. So this profession is insanely important in the city. It's the largest city in the world that you can't get to by road. So it's not very common to have big cars there or buses or any sort of big transportation vehicle like that. So motocarristas are basically the public transportation. So incredibly, of those 30,000 people, participants only estimated that 5 to 30 were women. So that raises questions of why, what societal constructs, what gender norms lead that to be the case, and encouraged me to reflect on both why that's the case and then how gender also impacts men in the profession. So basically what I've deduced from talking to participants and looking at literature on gender in Peru is that gender systems work for no one in this instance. It limits women from economic opportunities and doesn't allow people of all genders to operate in this profession, while at the same time imposing physically and mentally challenging expectations on male drivers. So one said, I have to fight hard and work hard so my children can keep studying, and what I have I give them, which taken in consideration with those gasoline costs, repair costs, rent costs, the cost of being a masculine provider in this instance, there's not opportunity to dedicate to your own life. Like, you don't have time to dedicate to your own life. You don't have money to invest in your own life. So thinking about how these gender norms impact both women and male drivers, people of all different gender identities, and the need to bend these norms and allow for solidarity and to allow people of all gender identities to work in ways that are traditionally coded as masculine and feminine. And there are already some examples of this happening. So for example, if a male driver falls ill one day, it's common for their partner to then drive the vehicle in that day, which reveals that men know that women can drive, and that myth is not something that they actually believe. It shows that it's more about control. And it's interesting that when ill, then it's a moment for solidarity, but in the day-to-day it's not. And there's a study by Bukele and Castro in Barranquilla, which shows that women are increasingly taking up this profession in that city and actually using it as a space to reject traditional gender norms. So the gender operates in very interesting and complex ways in the profession. I'm going to skip this poem, but I can share that anybody wants. References Bad Bunny, so I don't know, might be timely. I'm going to touch on this, and I'm probably going to skip a theme or two just to have more time for everybody else. One of the main interventions I'm trying to do with this work, and I think why multimodal work is so important, is thinking about the social perceptions of the profession and how people see motocarristas in the city. So I'm going to start on the right side of the screen. Societal perspectives, like people blame motocarristas for really diverse challenges and problems in the city, ranging from air pollution to making the city stressful and noisy to being why the city, quote unquote, has lost its charm. Some of those go really aggressive. One called the profession a malignant cancer on the city. There was an example in 2016 where a police chief called motocarristas delinquents, and in return for that, and in return for mandatory technical repair costs, they had a massive protest and ended up getting some of those costs reduced, but showing that they're willing to organize in response to some of these perceptions. And then there was this crazy Facebook post where a motocarrista had stopped to help a volunteer firefighter get to a fire that broke out in the city recently, I think in December, through the pouring rain, so there wasn't very many cars or anything going through the streets. And the firefighter posted about it after and thanked this motocarrista for doing it. But then in the comments, in addition to posts praising the motocarrista for being a good person and acting in solidarity, some said, we don't trust motocarristas anymore. What a good example for all those bad-mannered motocarristas. And one said, like, if everybody was like that, then it would be great to live here, showing that they don't think that that's common for people in this profession. And it's interesting, there's a case study in Bangkok with motorcycle taxi drivers there, how people talk about motorcycle taxi drivers as a whole as being like these delinquents, as being people that are dangerous. But then if you ask them, oh, so you don't ride in a motorcycle taxi then? Like, no, I have my motorcycle taxi drivers, they're great. So it's this contradiction between motorcycle taxi drivers as a profession and then the ones you work with individually. And that's interesting. It kind of shows how it operates at an individual neighborhood level. And then the reason that I think multimodal work can be really important is here is that some of the participants wanted initiatives to build understanding of motocarristas' labor experiences, quote unquote, so that we do not have to suffer in this profession. I don't necessarily have that big of ambitions for this type of work. I don't think it can achieve such socioeconomic transformation, but I think it can be a starting point for discussions on this topic, which is why I'm stressing it in the societal tensions part. One said that my work is more than sitting, waiting, driving. It also has to do with the passenger's comfort. And they said that trust is worth more than money. So this is very important to them. Real quick, with collective organizing, there are like 25 motocarrista associations in the city, and they work with professionalizations and trainings, uniforms, things like that. But in talking about collective organizing, and I think this is important for the case of the US too, I want to stress that it's not just something done by unions. Collective organizing can be done by all of you today. If you wanted, you could work together to start something. So independent drivers also have networks of mutual assistance, and they share job opportunities with each other, and they help each other out. So while the city, for example, I heard from a few union heads that a few years ago they tried to make a way bigger union, and the city, for fear of what that would look like to have 30,000 motocarristas collaborating together, just kind of shot that down before it became a bigger idea. But there is organization happening at a smaller scale, and there's collaborations between these two groups, between association drivers and independent drivers, when it comes to things like bigger protests. This is a really fun topic to think about. We'll just kind of keep this as an aesthetic idea for the purpose of this presentation, but essentially motocarristas both as an entrepreneurial act and to make the profession have more fulfillment for them, deck out their vehicles in all these beautiful ways. They have sayings on the back, they customize the seats, they have art drawn by them, their family, their friends, and this is a way both to make themselves stand out from the competition and to get more customers, but also just to have more pride in their vehicle and in the profession and more enjoyment. This was one of my favorite examples, having Pikachu art. This was also the most surprising interview because the other 39 were all entirely in Spanish, and then after about 3 or 4 sentences of Spanish, this motocarrista was like, actually, can we switch to English? Like, I speak more English. And I was like, oh, okay. So Pikachu car, English, and I was just totally disoriented and like so excited at this interview, but it's a great experience. And then here's more. So this is an example of how they're both aesthetic and functional. These bands look gorgeous and like go with the color scheme incredibly well, but they also keep dirt out of passengers' eyes. So that's something that's both aesthetic and functional. And then this one's very real. So their seats come leather, but leather in very hot weather does not go well together. That gets incredibly like uncomfortable for sitting on. So they've innovated like these little wire seats that they can sit on to let the air flow under. In terms of what needs to be done, this I would love to talk to people more about after if there's time, but one is the improved public image, and I think that that's where the multimodal work again can make an intervention. Improved road conditions is a very ambitious claim, but that's the most common claim that drivers had, so maybe that's something that can be organized and worked towards. And then more attention from local and national politicians, and not just when they're campaigning. They often go to motocarristas to try to organize a massive 30,000 person vote, but then forget about them as soon as they're elected, and that's kind of how the ruling class can work. So I think that in order to arrive at urban politics that makes sense, we first have to understand that the laborers who build and sustain the city every day have a claim to the unalienated right to make the city more after their own heart's desires. And that's not just something that's relevant in Iquitos. I encourage everyone here to reflect on that in Tallahassee, to reflect on that in any city where you live. Do the people who are making the city work, do the people that make your experience in the city possible, have a right to the city? Are they the ones deciding what the city looks like? Or is it somebody else? And who's benefiting? That poem gets pretty radical at the end, but hey. And then here, next steps, you can watch the pretty booklet scroll as I kind of explain this. So in April, hopefully I plan to go back to Iquitos and distribute several outcomes from this project. So one being this booklet that I'm writing right now. And that'll go back to all 40 participants from the study. Everyone will get a copy of this. It'll go to local universities, the libraries there, to just kind of distribute the results back to the people who produce the knowledge. Also do poetry readings while I'm there, partnering with Sentidos Revista Amazonica, which we'll talk about in a minute. And maybe do some public presentations of posters. And then I just see this as the beginning of this work, not by any stretch of the imagination as the end. So in August, I'll start 6 more years of school at Emory University Anthropology and continue working with motocarristas in Iquitos. And as I move forward with this, I would like to either do a comparative study with another city, include passengers' perspectives, which I did not interview any passengers during this project, and I definitely should have. Or perhaps to include more of the informal economy in Iquitos and try to interrogate the interactions and overlaps between the experience of street vendors and motocarristas, who are very important for mobility. Here's where I'd like people to get out their phones if you have signal or Wi-Fi. So this is a project by people in Iquitos. My friends there have kind of tagged myself and Matt here sitting in the front row. My roommate from UF, he's a trader from FSU, if anybody knows him, but now he's on the right side. So we've been working to manage the website for this poetry and literature review from Iquitos. This has poems from myself, but more importantly, poems from people in the city. And it's a way for people to get read, have their poetry read from the Amazon. And actually in our 3rd edition, Dr. Galliano is going to publish in that as well. He has a really cool poem that's never been published before, so that'll be exciting for the 3rd edition there. So that's the hyperlink. You can either take a picture and pull it up later, or just revistaamazónicasentidos.com. You can check that out. And every visit to that website will help us get funding for the project moving forward. So that's why I ask that everybody checks that out. And if you're a poet and you would like to potentially collaborate, let me know after, and we can talk about that too. And then I just want to thank everybody for being here today and listening to the presentation. But before I take a seat, as we move forward to these other presentations, I'd encourage everyone to reflect on how they overlap, what sort of commonalities we can find between these different talks to get a more holistic view at Iquitos. So we don't have to do this collaboratively because I want to let the next speaker continue in this space, but I encourage everybody to reflect on what connections we can make between my talk and these other great topics, how do they each individually help understand the rest, and what do they teach us as a whole. So with that, thank you all. I enjoyed talking with you all today, and please feel free to talk after. Thank you.
Thank you, William. What an honor to be published in your journal. To me, that's the biggest honor to be published in that journal, because I saw the first issue, and it's a collective effort of people from Iquitos and people from this country. So that is wonderful. I need to share with you that William was in 3400. That's when we met 5 years ago, 4 years ago.
Good stuff comes out of that class.
So anyway, malignant cancer. That hurts. That hurts me to hear that, about motocarristas in Iquitos, because a lot of those people are like family to me, and family to William. So anyway, our next presenter is Chanelle Dupuis, and she is bringing what transformational beings in Amazonian folktales can teach us about sustainable living. Chanelle Dupuis is a senior at Florida State University, where she studies Spanish and French with minors in Portuguese and German. She's interested in literature, endangered language, and bodily senses, specifically olfaction. Dupuis has published an article in the magazine Amazonia Latitude titled "To Speak is to Exist: The Case of Endangered Languages in Brazil and Ecuador." Thank you, Chanelle, for contributing with your work in this gathering. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Hi. So, good afternoon. My name is Chanelle Dupuis. I'm a senior here at FSU. And today I'm going to be presenting on the topic of Amazonian folktales. So I'm going to present on folktales from the Amazon and explain exactly how these tales can help us envision a more sustainable future. So I'll begin by defining what is a folktale. I'll give an example of an Amazonian folktale. I'll explain the various characteristics that are unique to Amazonian folktales, and then I'll show how these tales can teach us how to live more sustainably. So to begin, what is a folktale? What does this term mean, and how can its definition help us understand the evolution of folktales in the Amazon? So the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines a folktale as a characteristically anonymous, timeless, and placeless tale circulated orally among a people. It is a story that doesn't have a traceable source and is circulated by word of mouth. Thus, the origin of the folktales of the Amazon are unknown. The information carried in them, however, reveals a depth of knowledge about the natural world through years of observations and detailed knowledge of historical changes in the region. These folktales are important to look at because they carry information about the natural world, information about the past, information regarding societal values that are important to Amazonians today, and they also comment on globalization. The important thing to note is that they are not stagnant tales, but tales that are continuously changing and continuously commenting on our world today. So for this presentation, I'll be using as my main source Dr. Gallano's text, Cuentos Amazónicos. And this text contains various folktales from across the Amazonian basin. So some of these tales have titles in Portuguese or Spanish. So we see that the sources of these tales is very varied, but they all contain common characteristics and this common conceptualization of the natural world. And when looking at Amazonian folktales, we identify characteristics of Amazonian cosmovisions that are influenced by indigenous groups and others. So the multiplicity of sources and ideas represented in these tales is through this diversity of the tales and the diversity of transformational beings detailed in the cuentos. The language of the tales itself portrays this fluidity in boundaries and identity. As Michael Uzendusky explains when commenting on Cuentos Amazónicos, he says this boundary between mestizo and indigenous is more fluid than previously thought, and Gallano's writing reveals this fluidity in a creative way. It shows a common subjectivity that transcends ethnicity but does not obliterate its social presence. So this powerful quotation supports the notion that Amazonian tales are tales for today. They are tales that really question our received perceptions of race, ethnicity, and identity in Amazonia, and they're tales that reflect reality and imagination all at once. So I think the best way for me to really show what these tales are and the information that they contain and the value of Amazonian folktales is to give you an example. So for this presentation, I chose to focus on the cuento La Ciudad de los Delfines, the City of the Dolphins. So you have a bit of the excerpts from this tale here. And in this tale, we see a fisherman who's on the Amazon River since before dawn, and he still hasn't caught anything. So he becomes very frustrated. And when he sees a pink dolphin playing by his dugout, he relieves his anger by spearing the dolphin. The man leaves the injured dolphin behind, goes back home, and is later arrested by policemen who take him by boat to the police station. But then, suddenly, instead of going to the police station, the boat sinks into the river and arrives at the city under the water. And under the water, these dolphins live in a modern city with buildings, lights, cars, fountains, etc. And the man manages to leave the underwater world by using tobacco smoke. And when he returns home, he tells everyone that the dolphins are like people. And we see this here with Os botos são como a gente. Dolphins are like people, dolphins are like people. And so I really enjoy this tale because the message is very clear and it shows various aspects of the Amazonian imaginary. In our Western understanding of the world, we tend to divide nature and society. Nature does not interact with society, but lives to the side. So we live in this duality, and our conceptualization of the world is in this duality, where nature and society are separate. Fernando Santos Granero, from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, identifies that in the West, the material is considered as the only basis for the real. So that means that the invisible, transformational beings are not considered real to us or interacting with the real world. And even the language we use to talk about the natural world is incomplete. For example, David Abram, a cultural anthropologist, considers the topic of language and shows that writing systems are discourses that have become exclusively human, where the written system is a system that is reflecting the human form back upon itself. We must realize, most importantly, that there are groups that have not closed themselves within an exclusively human field of meaning and so still dwell within a landscape that is alive, aware, and expressive. Amazonian folktales are an example of this. So through these tales, we can rethink our conceptual system and reimagine our relationship with the natural world. They are symbolic narratives that provide an opening into a different way of thinking and therefore a different way of living. So in the example of folktale above, we can see how Amazonian folktales give volition, they give life to natural elements. So plants, animals, and other aspects of the environment suddenly take on these human qualities and interact with society. So this really forces the reader to question his conceptual understanding of the living and non-living, and question his relationship with the natural world. These tales move beyond the duality. There's a complex and nuanced understanding of their relationship with the natural world. For example, the dolphins, they have a voice. They can respond to human action. In this tale, a dolphin was killed, and then the dolphins came to the man to take him as basically a prisoner. So they have this they are active participants in the tale. The tale also shows how animism, the attribution of a soul to plants or innate objects, and also perspectivism, the view that all living things have a perspective of the world worth considering, are both important aspects in Amazonian cosmovisions and also in the Amazonian imaginary. So another thing that we see in these tales is how the local and the global are both seen through these tales, and Michael Uzendusky identifies ways to view the local as global, and I agree with his claim that Amazonian storytellers conceptualize themselves as fully modern subjects, but they define their subjectivity through fractal relationships with animals, spirits, and nature relationships. He shows how Amazonian tales are in fact defined simultaneously by the local and the global. So there is this knitted intersection between the local and internal understandings and the global and external understandings. That these tales have both this local information and global information mixed together in a knitted relationship. So Uzendusky shows how tales of exchange between dolphins and humans prove that boundaries of the local and global are actually transcended. He claims that because dolphins change corporal appearance, it shows that Amazonians understand that modernity is all about corporal appearance, right? And indeed, the way that the dolphins live in these underwater modern cities in places with large apartment buildings and fountains, it really shows how Amazonian folktales are commenting on the global while also asserting the local. So overall, this teaches us about the value of hybridity, the value of crossing these boundaries between local and global, and the value of continuity. These tales comment on the global while also continuing to define the local. So this here is a map that kind of shows what goes on in my mind when I think about Amazonian folktales. I decided the best way to really understand all of the characteristics of these tales is to create this visual. So the way to view and read this map is to start from the top to the bottom. So at the top you can see how Amazonian cosmovisions and the Amazonian imaginary come together in Amazonian folktales. So it's through the cosmovisions of Amazonians and their imaginary are seen together in the creation of these folktales. And then the folktales themselves have various characteristics, which are all in blue. So if you start to the left, one of the characteristics in these tales is perspectivism, where everything has a perspective that is worth considering. So because of perspectivism, we have the presence of transformational beings, which transformational beings are entities that change from one form to another. So in the example folktale I gave you, the dolphin is a transformational being because it changes from human form to animal form back and forth. And these transformational beings are proof that in the folktales there's a lot of crossing of boundaries. The boundaries that we might have established in our conceptual system of the world are crossed in these folktales through the presence of transformational beings, which is something very powerful. And then another thing that we see in these folktales is animism, of course, the attribution of human qualities to non-human things. And because of animism, there is also evidence of storied matter, which storied matter is a term that Serenella Iovino brings forward. And she explains that all matter tells a story. This means that all of matter fuels stories. So for example, a river can fuel different stories because it changes a path and influences so many people. And so through these folktales, we see how so many different parts of the ecosystem are creating stories and fueling stories. In these tales, we also see proof of reciprocity. And we saw this in the tale with the dolphins, where the man killing a dolphin, hurting a dolphin, there was a reciprocal action, there was a consequence to his action. And in all these tales, we see that reciprocity with nature. And because of the presence of reciprocity, it teaches us more about sustainability, or helps us think that we need to live sustainably with the environment because there are consequences to our actions. And then the tales are also symbolic narratives. So of course, these tales carry certain moral values because they're meant to be told to the community and teach people about how to live, how to share certain moral values. And the tales are also usually these oral narratives, so they also carry elements of storytelling. And storytelling is a type of performance. It is an art of performance. Therefore, Amazonian folktales are a performance in themselves. And overall, all the tales really comment on modernity and globalization, which is why I put at the bottom commentary on modernity. And then also the tales are a creative way out. So that's my map of kind of what goes on in my head. And we can see really that these tales are establishing a new conceptual system, a conceptual system that is different from ours. So a conceptual system is in essence how we conceptualize the world. And our conceptual systems are very important because they determine how we use language, how we act, and how we think. So researchers George Lakoff and Mark Johnson have shown how our conceptual systems are metaphorical in nature and how these metaphors actually affect how we think and act. So metaphors structure our words, our thoughts, our actions. And this is really important because it means that language is a reflection of our conceptual understanding of the world. So in Amazonian folktales, we really see that there are different metaphors being used to explain the world. And most striking is the use of familial terms to explain the spirit of the natural world and explain how plants and animals are living beings. For example, the cuentos use a lot of words like madre or abuelo, tío, so mother, father, uncle, to explain these relationships between mythical beings and the human world. So for example, when talking about the Yakumama, the indigenous people say, ahí vivía la Yakumama, la madre del agua, de los peces y todas las ferias. So there lived the Yakumama, the mother of the water, the fish, and other spirits. And the Yakumama is given human characteristics in that ella cambia todo el tiempo, she changes all the time. So in the same way, there are relationships between trees and spirits. For example, the Huayra Caspi is said to be the mother of the Huayra Mama. And these examples show that the Amazonian conceptual system imagines plants, trees, and mythical beings using the metaphor of family. So words like madre, hijo, abuelo, tío are seen throughout Amazonian folktales. So this means that because the natural world is conceptualized through the metaphor of a family, this metaphor influences Amazonian thoughts, actions, and words used to describe the natural world. So if plants and trees are conceptualized as having mothers or being the mother of another mythical being, this affects how individuals will respond towards and speak about such plants and trees. So in essence, because our conceptual system is metaphorical in nature, and because language is a reflection of this, the language used in Amazonian folktales proves that Amazonians conceptualize the natural world in a different way than we do. And they also use the metaphor of a family to understand these invisible relationships that exist between plants, trees, rivers, space spirits, and beyond. So it might seem something inconsequential, but actually your conceptual system and the words that you're using to conceptualize the world really affect your actions, your thoughts, etc. And we see this through this metaphor of family in the folk tales. So, although the reader is unlikely to understand fully or be willing to conceptualize the world through these Amazonian cosmovisions, even just pursuing an imaginary or reading these narratives can enhance or begin to rupture the inherited boundaries that we have in our conceptualizations of the natural world. Thus, these tales are tales for our modern world. They push us to rethink and reconceptualize our accepted boundaries between nature and society, and they teach us to view the natural world in a different way. They encourage us to think of reciprocity and to think of the perspective of other living things. There's an emphasis on continuation and reciprocal living. The tales don't end with this triumph over evil or a clean plot ending, such as fairy tales from Germany, for example. Instead, the tales always end with a warning or with a moral value, with a teaching. And I find that these characteristics, such as this, make Amazonian folktales tales for our world today, that these are values and warnings that need to be heard right now in the age of climate change. They teach us more sustainable ways of living with the environment and show us the benefits of changing the way that we think about the natural world. Most importantly, these tales allow us to listen, to smell, to hear, to touch, to see the Amazon in its entirety. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanelle. We at the Department of Modern Languages and Linguistics I feel so proud of you, and I am so honored to think that you were my student a couple of years ago in our 3400 intermediate Spanish. Okay, our next presenter is Ivan Kelsch, and he is a marketing major and a Spanish minor at Florida State University. Through his position as director of marketing for Innerlight Surf Shops, he created a collaborative event known as Clean the Sabine, which in its first event cleaned over 350 pounds of trash from Florida's intercoastal waterways. Kelsch is currently expanding his environmental marketing efforts through field research in the Peruvian Amazon, starting from a local scope. Welcome to our Amazonia Week. Ivan.
Thank you so much for coming. Let's go ahead and click on. Let's click there. Oh, there we go. First of all, how's everyone doing this afternoon?
Great.
Thank you so much for being here. I really want to start by thanking Dr. Galliano. He put so much time and effort to make all this possible. We've seen it in our classes. I'm sure if anyone knows you or anyone knows him, you guys have seen that in any other aspect of his life. Just a great all-around guy. I'm sure there's quite a few other hands that have helped here, and I really want to thank all of you as well. Just so heads up, I do have a concussion right now, so if I kind of slur my words or I kind of lose my space, just stick with me. So as I said, I'm Evan Kelsch, and tonight we're going to kind of take a little bit of a look into the societal aspects that play into the pollution and contamination in the Peruvian Amazon. A little bit about me. As he mentioned, I'm a marketing major with a Spanish minor. Professionally and academically, my focuses have been in marketing and sales, but through traveling all my life, I picked up a good amount of Spanish, made it my minor here, and upon taking Professor Galliano's classes, I kind of came across the idea of heading down to the Peruvian Amazon to do some field work that it ended up being this presentation. So I got my brother, and a couple weeks later, we were down in South America. We were staying in Pachacocha, which is a small indigenous village just outside of Iquitos. And a couple things that are really important to understand about this area is that, as the earlier presenter mentioned, it's only accessible by boat and by plane. You cannot get cars in and out. This makes their trash pickup incredibly difficult. But it's also, just like all the other villages in this area, this town is extremely reliant upon all of the resources from the river and the jungle. It's really their heartline there. So as I mentioned, we stayed in Pachacocha. We were a little bit into the jungle in a small house And we stayed with, as you can see, Jose and Marita and their family, and they just really became a family of our own. Just the sweetest human beings I've ever met in my entire life, and I can't thank them enough. Also, everyone you see here in these pictures was incredibly integral to just every part of this trip and research. The gentleman all the way over on the left here, I guess it's your right, it's Emmanuel. He's a motor car driver. I'm sure you know him, you met him. He's a great guy. It's his son Fabio, and then we were all of our friends, Jose and Marita. They really showed us the unparalleled heart of this area, the great parts, the beauty of the river and the jungle, the mythical aspects, and kind of how it plays into their daily life. And through their eyes, they also showed us the other side of Iquitos. It's the Iquitos of high levels of poverty and unemployment, and as I mentioned earlier, there's no roads in and out, so the trash pickup becomes incredibly difficult, which plays a huge role in just pretty much everything that goes on in this area. And it's just becoming a huge source of pollution and contamination. And so we kind of think, like, why do we care? Like, this is super far away from us. This doesn't really matter. Like, but then you kind of have to think of it as a global aspect. A quote from Katrina Zimmer from National Geographic. She doesn't equate the Amazon to lungs as a lot of people do. She equates it as to a giant air conditioner that kind of just sucks a lot of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and just kind of mitigates the entirety of climate change on a global aspect. And another kind of smaller part that I came across when I was talking with Herman Ruiz is that a lot of the trash just kind of gets put off to the sides in dry areas, and because of these increasing fluctuations of rains and flooding, these random floods that they previously hadn't been able to predict, they just come through and wash all of this trash into the river. As you know, the river goes to the ocean, and the ocean goes to all over the world. So anything that hits this river could one day end up in our backyard, on our beaches, and what have you. So I also went out and spoke to Alfonso and Laura. They're some Germans that live in this place, and they run a restaurant. Now, they think kind of differently than a lot of people there, which I'll get into later. But essentially, she was kind of playing into the aspect of people are becoming more conscious of this condition. They realize how this is going to affect us as a whole, and so they're becoming more activated. They're really taking steps, and they're trying to. And she's a big part of it. Their entire family is. They go out and they collect trash. They do it with tourists, other nationalities. They go and they grab it. But one thing she mentioned was they don't have anywhere to put it. They don't have a dump to take to. They don't have trash trucks that come around and grab it. So she doesn't know where to go. She doesn't know what to do with it, and she's continuously looking for solutions to this. So now that we kind of have an understanding as to why we care, I started delving into some of my deeper interviews, and I chose a kind of wide generational gap. I have 3 interviews up here on here now. I started with Fabio here. He's a local student in this area, and he's 13, and he kind of sees this. His father is a motor car driver. He lives in pretty much in the heart of the city with a lot of the other people in Iquitos, and he really states a lot about kind of the lack of support they have from this government. The government is pretty corrupt, as we'll get into later, but they have this faint idea of that they should be doing something, especially the people in the area. They're getting bombarded with all this trash. They know something should happen, and so they have an organization that ends up taxing trash outputs for everyone. But then the government never comes and actually picks any of the trash up, and so these people are getting taxed and they have to pay for their trash output, but they have no actual support from the government, and they're not helping them in that, so it's just building up, and they're losing more and more money. And as he says, everyone eats these fish from the rivers that they're throwing the trash into. They're fully aware this is where they get it. Everyone's responsible, everyone's taking a part in this. But they still toss it in there. They still go fishing later in the day to feed their family with it. So I talked to Harold here, who is a local school employee. He's around 35, and he kind of delves into the aspect of how we teach our kids. He states there's 3 main things that is kind of happening. Is the contamination is getting worse, and this is kind of resulting in loss of the Amazon, and this is all because of the lack of people that are receiving environmental education. It states here, like, you see these kids, they see you throw their trash away, they see what's happening, they understand that, but if you don't actually follow through and you don't give them an example, they're not going to be able to really internalize it. They're not going to be able to prospect that out to the rest of their lives and use it as a model for behavior. And so that's a great place to start, is actually showing a good example, because the government's not going to help. The school systems, that's an entire web of things that I am not even nearly qualified enough to speak on. And we're kind of trying to look at what can we do as people here? What can the people do that are actually sitting there? And so I spoke to Juana here. She is a local business owner, and she states a little bit as to the environment itself. The climate change has started making everything a lot more intense. It started just really increasing the heat and the rain, and it's also changing the predictability of it. It's happening in seasons that it wasn't before. And so she doesn't know if people don't have the information or not, but they know that it's happening. They see the fish that are dying. They see all of these things happening, and this is their lifeline. They live in this every single day. And so they're begging the authorities to send out trash trucks, and sometimes they go, sometimes they don't. You guys saw the roads earlier. It's very, very fickle in this area. So before we start to get a good perception of what's going on here, we have to understand a lot of key things. Primarily is that they do not live with the same societal norms we live with. They are a mix of old world traditions and Western consumerism that's kind of moving in on them now. They don't think capitalistically. Essentially what this means is they define success, excuse me, they define success extremely different than we do. I was speaking with a gentleman down there, and he kind of stated, in America, we go to school, we go to college, we get a job, and then we make money, we buy a house, 3.5 kids with a white picket fence. That's the American dream. There, it's inherently different. They live off of relationships. They live off of the community. They live off of spending time with their family. They live off of spending time with their neighbors, exchanging ideas, exchanging love, and that's what they consider to be success down there. They consider closeness with their environments, closeness within their ecosystem, their own market within their area. That is exactly what they consider success. And so when we look at it, it's kind of comparing apples and oranges here. We have to understand that they're in a different reality. They actually live in a different time frame. We experience what is called monochronic time, which is very scheduled and rigid. We had this, it's scheduled from 4 to 7. From 7:30 to 8:30, we're going to go to Tin Lizzie's. From there, we're going to go do this and do that and what have you. And so it's very rigid and it's very laid out. It's very long term as well. They experience what is called polychronic, and it's extremely fluid. It adapts, it changes. An hour to them can mean 3 hours one day to a half an hour the other day. It's extremely in the moment, and that's what they base a lot of their lives off of. And this is really common with high context cultures. And so what high context cultures are it's a culture, especially within business. When we look at it, we look at a culture where there's not a lot of contracts, there's not a lot of spelled out agreements on everything. A lot of it's based off of trust, off of context, that you have relationships with these people before they live in your community, you know them. Whereas here, we don't operate off of trust. We operate off of these contracts. We operate off this notion that everything is made to exist in production. It's made to this thing. If it's not producing a certain output, then it doesn't matter. It's not based off of a relationship we had with this. So moving on to that, from a marketing aspect, essentially what we want to ask is how do we convince these people to not pollute their own river that they're eating from every day? How do we show them that it's not the right way? And so what we have to understand is that this weird mix of the old world traditions and the Western consumerism mixing in with it is it creates a huge confusion for them. They're being told to live for these goals and produce and everything, and this government is watching to see if they produce, to allocate any resources as an investment, not as just a baseline of living. And so what we do in marketing is we kind of break it down into the hierarchy of needs. We want to get our market segment to actually be able to purchase, in this term, what we're selling. And so here what we're selling is we're selling safety needs. We're selling don't contaminate. Don't get your pollution going in your own street. Don't destroy the food that's going to feed your family the next day. And so that's not going to happen. You don't market a Rolex to someone who just got their first job and they're trying to get their career set up. You want to market it to the segment that you know it's going to happen. And so what's happening with this weird clash is these people are living in their old traditions. They're living in their basis of success, which is completely congruent to their time, but they're also getting bombarded by this Western consumerism, these products every day being shoved down their throats. And it kind of gives them a momentary joy. It kind of does. If they're not having a good day, they can go buy a TV. But another thing that's happening is that there's these trees in these areas that are very easy for them to cut down. They burn it down to a charcoal that they can sell to other vendors in the area. And it's a very quick couple dollars. And so what they'll do is they'll cut down these trees, make this charcoal. They'll make a couple dollars, take their family out to eat. But then they're decreasing their forestry in this area, and it's all kind of playing together. And so I went and spoke with Roman Ruiz, who's the director of the I normally can pronounce it when I'm not borderline concussed, but it's a national reserve that is in Peru. It's a huge part of the Iquitos community, and this guy, I'm sure you've heard him being mentioned a couple times today in his past presentations, but he's a real head. He knows a lot of what's going on. He's very integral, and everything kind of passes through him. And we kind of focused on a couple different things, but mainly we focused on the corruption as to what's happening. He says that it's happening on all aspects. While it's pretty trickle down from the top, even the lower police, the lower municipalities, they're still in on it. They're still a part of it. As I mentioned earlier, they kind of look at how they delegate their resources as an investment, and so this isn't a capitalistic area. It's not going to be based on production and everything like that. It's going to be based on living, and so they end up not investing these resources to these people, and it causes a kind of a rippling effect. And one of those effects is, while they started privatizing their national reserves, they ended up selling like permits to the oil companies, the gold companies, all of these people that are coming in that can pay, that actually produce a monetary reward for them, instead of allowing fishermen that have been there, their family have been there for centuries, they know these rivers like the back of their hand, they're not allowed in there anymore. And it's creating kind of this weird divide as to, what do we actually define as this nature? What do we define as this area? Do we define it as this tree and this bush or whatever, or do we define it as the life that's in there, including the people that have fished and harvested this area for centuries? But now they're looking at it kind of as a sales point. They're like, do you want access to this park? Well, they can't pay for it, and we already kicked them out. So here's your ability. Go drill. Go get gold. And so that also kind of shows the bureaucracy that's happening, the mix of bureaucracy, because for a really long time they operated their fishing seasons off of the water levels, because there's a dry time and there's a wet time, and those water levels raise and they lower. And when they raise, these trees that are on the border of the river, on the shores, they drop fruit, and when the water's high enough to get up there, so on the lower end of the ecosystem, these small fish can eat these fruit, and it pushes all the way through in the energy cycle and creates a sustainable life for the entire river. And that is when they fish, is when they're able to do it. But now what's happening with this climate change is it's altering. It's becoming unpredictable. These dry and wet seasons that have been on record for years and years and years are randomly shifting. And so now what's happening is these fishermen are fishing during the low times. There's not enough fish, and it's drying the river out. And as I mentioned earlier, it kind of plays into an economic basis, and fishing is the number one economic thing in this area. This is where they get their protein. This is where they get their food. And so when you take away this economic basis from a city that is already high in unemployment, you're dropping them down further and further into their physiological needs and their lack of ability to be motivated to care about where they put this trash the next day, instead of just simply feeding them. And so it really shows like a huge web of all these things that are just kind of catch-22s. It's just, they're all playing into each other, and they're not allowing each other to get better. And all of this is just kind of coded by the fact that the education system in this area is also poor. And not only like an official school education, but what I mentioned earlier, from the families, from what they're teaching their young, like how to actually grow up and treat the area with respect, is kind of losing its way. So what do we do? As I mentioned earlier, I am in no way qualified to speak on the political or education or even municipal areas, but what I can say is that I am from marketing. I do see the value in bumping these people's living level above the physiological into their safety needs on their Maslow's hierarchy needs. So I met with Edgar. Edgar here he's a local business owner, but in 2003 he started kind of getting a little low on food for the area. And so he started developing this kind of system in an alleyway. Essentially, it's just sustainable farming. This is a pretty long, just kind of skim over it if possible. But I'm going to explain everything in a lot more detail. So here's what we come across. Edgar has this restaurant, right? It's really cool. He has really cool food there. But in the alleyway, right next to the side, right here, it's smaller than a 10-foot sliver in this room. It's tiny. It's extremely sustainable. And so what he does in this alleyway is he plants a lot of these plants that he has. And when the leaves fall from these plants, he puts them over in this corner with the guano from the guinea pigs that he has. He just has a bucket under their cage that it drops into, puts it all there, and he lets it decompose for about 7 days. On the 7th day, he brings it over to this trough, and he puts all of the compost in on the trough, and he pours rainwater into that. And so what this does is it allows the water to trickle down and get all the nutrients from all this compost. And he fills these bottles with it, and he kind of calls these magic bottles. That's what he uses to water all of the plants in this area. And so from there, what really killed me, as soon as I walked in, my jaw dropped. I was like, how have you been this ingenuitive? Every single thing he farms with here is trash he found off the side of the road. He cleans up as much as he possibly can, and he finds second uses for this. So it's essentially reduce, reuse, recycle here. And so he has these plastic bottles. And so these are absolutely everywhere here because the water systems in Iquitos is not strong enough to produce clean water for everyone. So they're constantly getting these 2-liter water bottles that are made of plastic, and they are everywhere. And so what he does is he cuts them in half, flips the nozzle over, plants the plant in there, whatever it may be, and he pours that water into there. And that water trickles through, feeds the plant, collects in the bottom. And he just switches that right around. So if they have a dry period, it saves water, it saves food because he's getting it from the compost, and it's allowing these plants to go. And over here, he has these PVC pipes that he found on the side of the road. With like half a jug of water, he can feed about 15 plants just because it flows right on through. And as you can see here, they're all planted in these like laundry bins and everything like that. And like he has so many more pictures that I just couldn't fit on the slide of just incredibly genius like construction that he made with these bottles and everything. It's pretty wild. And so, like, what all does this mean? As I mentioned, there's years left to go in the governmental support, changing the infrastructure, changing people's motivations. But right now, we're looking at kind of a cross-section analysis of this. We see these people that don't have enough food to eat. They don't have enough desire to go out and like they don't live in the same reality that the consumerism comes into. So they don't understand the desire to make developments that they do. So they work within their own realm, and so they're not meeting their physiological needs. And so from there, they're only worried about that. That is their main source of focus. And so what this allows people to do is it allows them to sustain their food, grow enough for a community. If 15 houses on a block could live off of this one alleyway with the production methods he's putting out. And what this does is it allows them to, one, help clean up some of the trash that's over-encumbering the city, and two, get a meal for their family every single night. And then from there, it's just one less brick in their backpack, one less thing to worry about. They can start to learn and operate, especially with systems that Edgar has. They learn to learn and operate under these non-contamination methods, and they're able to teach that to their kids. So essentially what I like to think of him as is a step in the right direction, and to show that all solutions aren't incredibly complicated. All solutions aren't something to shy away from just because it seems very political based or whatever, like something like that. They can be wildly simple, and they can hit a lot of different aspects. And I'm really glad I met all these people. And again, I want to say thank you to everyone listening to me, and a huge thanks to Professor Galliano. Is that all? Do any questions?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ivan, for bringing us this huge contribution of yours from the marketing perspective, but also showing the ingenuity of Amazonians and how they are as you say, moving in the right direction and into a more sustainable way of life there with these proposals, right? Our next presenter is Diego Mejía Prado, who is a PhD student in Spanish Literature and Cultural Studies at Florida State University and a biologist from Universidad Javeriana in Colombia. His research interests intersect topics from both the natural sciences and humanities, including environmental issues, justice, history, eco-criticism, and the relationship between nature and culture, specifically in riverine and indigenous communities in Amazonia. Prado is currently studying new strategies of environmental protection and exploitation, as well as other environmental problems in the Peruvian Amazon in relation to their different representations in literature, science, oral narratives, and global markets. He has published 2 books on biological and cultural topics related to plants, and numerous articles dealing with environmental issues in Colombia. And I must also add that we are lucky to have Diego here at the university. I know that he's a very beloved professor of many students, of our students, but I wanted to add to his background. He had a scientific career back in Colombia many years ago, and he has done tons of field work in many areas of Colombia. So welcome, Diego. We are very lucky to have you here.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you to Dr. Galeano as well for organizing this Amazonia Week and for being always on top of the things that are happening in Amazonia. So today, I'm going to show some photography that I've been doing in the Amazonia, and then I'm going to talk about biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity, the consequences, and what's going on specifically in a national reserve called Pacaya, Samiria, which is, I'll show you where it is. Okay. So 1 year ago, we talked here about my dissertation work, my PhD work, which is analyzing the current environmental crisis in Amazonia and the ways the people are responding to it, how communities are organizing. And I said here that the current crisis is related to this idea of abundance, diversity, vastness, resilience that we think or that we used to think that Amazonia has. So we used to think it's so big, it's so diverse, it's so resilient that she will heal itself. Now we know that that's not real. We have lost a lot of biodiversity. I'm going to talk first, we're going to talk about biodiversity and the loss of biodiversity. Then the Amazonia as a source of carbon. This is a pretty new concept. We're starting to see that Amazonia is not anymore a sink, a carbon sink. It's not anymore something that is going to help us sequester all the excess carbon that we have in the atmosphere, but is being a source, is adding carbon to the environment. So that's pretty critical, and that's happening right now, and that's what is called the tipping point. Okay, so we're gonna start talking about biodiversity. Where were these pictures taken? Where is my work? So here is Iquitos. We cannot see that well. Here is the Pacific Ocean. You can see it goes all the way here. Here we have the Andes, the Cordillera de los Andes. Lima is about here. So usually we travel from here to Lima, and then from Lima to Iquitos, which is the city we've been talking about today. And then here you take a boat and go up the Amazon River. This is where the Amazon River starts, where the Marañón River and the Ucayali River joins. There we have the Amazon River. This is the Amazon. So you go up river through Iquitos, then take the Ucayali River, and then we go to this little town called Bretaña, that I'll show you in a minute. So that's the boat. This is in Iquitos. So these are the boats you can take to get there, up river. It's a very nice trip. Well, it depends on the weather, but it's usually very nice. You spend usually like 2 days in the boat going up river, so you see the night, the sunsets. Some of them are big enough so you can hang a hammock. And then you arrive here. This is Bretaña. Bretaña is a very little town, and it's very recognizable because of the oil tower that you will notice even if it's at night. Right in front of Bretaña, so that little town is right here in this river. In front, we cannot see here, but there's a Pacaya River. And all this area is there, you see, Reserva Nacional Pacaya Samiria. All this area between these two rivers is the second biggest national park in Peru, and also the second biggest in Amazonia. It's huge. All this area is huge. So it has a lot of points of entrance, most of them through the Marañón River. Tourism here is kind of popular, but this area is not very touristic. Only some cruise ships get there. So yeah, that's Bretaña. So we're here, Bretaña. Here right in front of this is the entrance of the park, the Pacaya River. Okay, so first we're gonna talk about biodiversity. I hope the pictures talk about biodiversity, and I will be talking about biodiversity loss. That is what is we're seeing now. In November, the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity by the United Nations, they say what they do is that they expect a lot of money, and they make a big meeting with researchers, politicians, environmental leaders, a lot of people. And they conclude, this hasn't been published yet. This is gonna be published in May. It's like a 1,500 pages report. But in November, in a big meeting on biodiversity, they reveal, like they give us a little sneak peek. The conclusion of that report is gonna be that we're about to lose 1 million species in the next years. We don't know how many years, they don't say. But 1 million species are at risk. So we see all this biodiversity that makes you think, oh my God, it's so abundant, so diverse, but we are losing all that diversity really, really quick. And something that is very important, because a lot of people say, oh, but that's a natural process. Extinction is a natural process. It's okay, a lot of species have extinguished in time since we know the dinosaurs, so it's totally natural. It might be a natural process, but for the first time, we can almost certainly say this is because of us. It's not a natural process, although we are also a natural species, but it's not like what we call a natural process. We are causing this. Okay. So in Amazonia, what can you see? You can definitely note that we are losing species, clearly. You can see that we have empty forests and rivers. This is an old concept, 1992. Kent Redford was the first one to talk about empty forests. Empty forests are forests that look very good. They look high, they look natural, they look lush, full of green, but there's something missing. There are specific species missing because they have been hunted like for years. So I'm gonna show you that. I like this picture because here you can see the fluctuation of the flooded jungle. It's not even this is not even the dry season. We're in a boat here. You can see here the tip of the boat. So there's still deep water. So it's gonna go even down, and you can see the mark here. In some places it's like 12, 13 meters. That's like almost 40 feet, the difference. So all this jungle is underwater. Right now it's getting underwater, December, January. All the jungle, only the higher trees are okay. What are the empty forests? So as I told you, this is this was defined by Kent Redford in 1992. But we're talking about that now in Amazonia. So you see big forests, you see tall trees, everything so lush, it's full of mosquitoes, everything. So you see there should be a lot of things here. Well, no, there's not a lot of things here. For example, Esquivel and colleagues, they made this study, and we know there are about 16,000 separate tree species. But now they think about only 200 of those 16,000 species are really dominant. I mean, 200 species that you can easily find. And now with the climate change, that is something we've been talking a lot about, there's being a selection over trees that can tolerate drought and high temperatures. So that's even changing. So we see, oh yeah, 16,000 species of trees in the Amazon. Well, the reality is that we might have way less than that who are really thriving. The other ones might just be waiting to die. This is not dead. This is a punga. You can see the red fruit. It's one of the few tropical trees that lose their leaves every season. Yeah. So how, for example, look how bad is the situation. So Antunes and colleagues from Brazil and Australia make this huge study published in Science Advances in 2016. Between 1904 and 1969, at least 23 million animals representing only 20 species of mammals and reptiles were hunted for hide, fur, skins, everything. These are legal reported kills. So we can expect this to be way, way, way higher because it doesn't take into account archives that were lost or that they don't exist anymore for any reason, illegal activities, which is usually more than double the legal activity because it's cheaper to do it illegally. And this doesn't take into account what people hunt for surviving, what they hunt for just for eating, and no plants, only animals. But it's scary, it's very scary. And you can see this phenomena when we talk about losing species, we start seeing, for example, this phenomena when there are less animals in the forest. Oh, this green line is the price. So when there are less animals, the price is higher. So the pressure to kill them is also higher. This is very typical of, for example, of overfishing. Right now, the most expensive fishes, like the bluefin tuna, they're so expensive because there are no bluefin tuna in the oceans, or there are too few left in the oceans, which makes even more difficult the situation of the species because more people want to kill them because they say, we got a fish of those and then it's gonna be $1 million. It's very similar. What happened to the plants, to the trees? The same thing. We already saw the paper by Esquivel where he showed that we are losing trees, a lot of trees. And then you see these huge trees, and you say, you see big, they're enormous old trees, and you see this looks pretty healthy. You don't see these trees easily in the Amazon. You have to go to protected areas. It's the only way. And even there, they have to take a lot of care, because they can cut really easy and really quick one of these trees, and that's a lot of money. And it's easier because they don't have to go and look for 200 trees, just one, and they have all the money for 6 months to survive. So it's the same thing. That shows us when you see these trees, you see, okay, maybe the Amazon should be like this, or should have more trees like this. But if you go to a forest that is not being actively protected, you don't find this. And that's a symptom of how sick is the environment, how sick is. Because it should be like this. Almost all of it should be like this. There's no reason not to. Okay, what is the problem? What happens with the loss of biodiversity? Why is bad to lose biodiversity? A lot of people say it's a natural process. Okay, this guy Sule, for the first time in 1980, showed the importance of keeping biodiversity high. So he proposed the mesopredator release hypothesis. He was working in California, in islands of California, when there were predators who were coyotes. So I don't have a coyote photo, but I have this. We're gonna say he's a predator, like an apex predator, a bad predator, like sharks or things like that, jaguars, things like that. It's not, it's a super harmless snake. I was super close there, she's not interested. And then we're gonna say, yeah, I took all the pictures there, yes. This is the mesopredator, and this is the minimal predator. So the hypothesis says that once you kill all the apex predators, there's gonna be an abundance of the mesopredator, and then all these ones are gonna kill these ones. So the hypothesis says if we kill this one, we're also killing this one. In the experiment they did, this one was coyote, so nobody cares. Kill them all, it's totally okay. But the problem is they noticed when they killed the coyotes, they were also killing the birds, because there was an abundance of skunks, badgers, opossums, mice, all the things that the coyotes are supposed to eat. Because there were an abundance of that, they were eating the birds. So almost to extinction in some of these islands. 11 years later, in 1999, he again published the results of this study made in California, in mainland, not on islands, and the results were the same. So there was a big explosion in popularity in conservation saying, so we need to take care of the predators. We need to protect the predators. If we protect sharks, if we protect the jaguar, we've been protecting everyone and everything. And it was like a big fashion. So they start sending money to the Amazon to save the jaguar, for example, specifically mammals, because what we lost more is mammals, because people was specifically protecting birds. You know, they are the most charismatic species, the most popular among nature lovers. So they say, we want the birds alive. That means we need the predators as well to keep. But that's a problem as well, because people were also only giving money to certain species. What are we seeing right now in a natural experiment? This is a natural experiment. So since the late 80s, we're having this pandemia of Batrachotrichium. It's a fungi that is killing all amphibians, especially frogs, because it affects his skin. Have you heard about that? There's a mass extinction of amphibians, frogs in the world, especially in the tropics, because of these fungi. Now, look, how recent is this? This is Science, maybe the most important science magazine in the world or journal in the world. February 2020 is right now. They're starting to see that the reptiles that live out of the frogs are also declining almost to the extinction in response of all of these frogs dying because of the fungus. So a lot of experiments are showing, okay, the important is not only this one. If we kill all these ones, at the same time, this one is also gonna die. If we kill off that one, the other is gonna die too. So what are the conclusion about this is that biodiversity is important. Okay, why? Why is important? Let's keep talking about why it's important. This is also a new study, 2019, that shows that forests, they made this in vitro. They make like little forests, let's say, with plants, and they start removing animals from there. And they also study, especially in Asia, Africa, and America del Sur, South America, they started forests that are being protected in the last years, although they are degraded. The most biodiverse, the fastest these forests recover. But it's super clear. So that's one of the things we're talking right now. Why we need to keep biodiversity? Because that helps the forest recover, if that's what we need. Why else? Why it is important? So this phenomenon of killing everything, losing biodiversity, is called defaunation. So disrupts of the plant-animal interactions. There are always animal-plant interactions. For example, dispersion of seeds, living, fertilization, lot of relationships, seed predation. A lot of seeds depend on one specific animal. They won't germinate if they haven't gone through an intestine of a specific animal, for example. So if we lose that animal, we don't know, but we are also losing trees, or the trees that depend on that animal. And the other way around too. When we kill the trees, we're also killing the animals, herbivory. Pollination, for example, if we kill insects that, for example, orchids, they're very, very specific on what insects pollinize the orchids. So if we kill one of those insects, we're also gonna lose orchids. And more than 80% of tropical forest woody plants, trees basically, produce vertebrate dispersed seeds. And vertebrates are the most affected, the species more affected with this defaunation. Usually, the biggest animals are the ones that we're disappearing faster. What else? Higher taxonomic and evolutionary diversity is expected to maximize ecosystem function and productivity. So now we're talking about conservation. We need these forests to make money for the people who live in them, for the people who's around. So how do we make them more productive? Well, having more species, make them clearly more productive, more fertile. We'll see, more fertile. Listo. Oh, so this is a very important and recent study. What they do, they measure the energy movement in a forest, in an environment, how easy it degrades, how easy it converts, for example, a leaf. They can check a single leaf in different forests and check how long it takes for that leaf to become fertilizer for the soil. It's kind of like obvious, right? The most animals we have in a forest, the quicker we're gonna make that cycle go around. This is a tree. This is a flying tree. I think this is the biggest flying tree in America. It's a tuyuyu. Okay. Listo. Fertility. This is so important because now all the conservation strategies in the Amazon are trying to show the people the economic advantages of taking care of the forest, of conserving. So it's very important because now we can say through science, we can go and say to the people there, hey, if you keep this forest as it is, it's just more fertile. It's gonna make more money for you, either in tourism or if you're gonna do whatever, if you're gonna plant some things. So biodiversity is important because it makes the healing of the forest quicker, and that's important because we're gonna see at the end, because the forests are more productive, way more productive, and because there are more species, and that means more tourism and more ecosystemic services. Okay, so conclusion, all species matter, all of them. Now we're not talking about we're gonna take care of the jaguar, the anaconda, like these famous species. No, now we know we need to take care of biodiversity, all of them, all of the species. This is a bug. This is a real bug. Like, I'm not saying a bug in general. It's what they call the real bugs. The assassin. It's a nymph. It's a juvenile. That's why you don't recognize it. But when you see bigger, he changes. Okay. What are we talking about? This last year, since the last time we talked here 1 year ago, we are talking about the tipping point. Amazonia is reaching the tipping point. What is that tipping point? Well, the point of we're not going back again. The point where Amazonia is starting to see a carbon source, a contamination source, a pollution source for the world, for the planet, not only for the region. The theory of the tipping point says it starts by claiming that Amazonia produces so much steam through the transpiration of the trees. Think about trees as straws, just throwing vapor, water vapor all day long in the environment. That huge vapor over Amazonia moves all around the continent and even to Europe. So we're saying we're changing that. We're changing that model. That's why we're having hotter days, hotter seasons, dry seasons that are longer and hotter, etc. Because we are messing with all this system, which is supposed to be the biggest system, at least in the Western Hemisphere, is the biggest climatic system. So the Lovejoy and Nobre started talking. They're very famous. He's from California. He's from Brazil. They work together. They may be one of the most important scientists in this climatology of the Amazon. And they started proposing for the first time in 2016 the savanization of Amazonia. They start saying, hey, this is going to be a savanna, a full savanna. And once that happened, there's no way back. That's the tipping point, 2016. And they've been talking about that, environmental disaster, climatological disaster. We need to stop deforestation. We need to protect Amazonia. We need to protect the biodiversity, etc. Okay, Magala is this year, 2019 also, but this is like November. This is very recent. This is after the fires, big fires we had this year in Amazonia. Did you hear about it? Yes, but they were not the biggest in history. We've had way more worst fires like that before. They were just the most famous, which is also important. So these guys went to Bolivia and studied all the glaciers there because they were studying those glaciers before those fires. So they say after the fires, we're gonna keep taking data and see if those fires so far away have any impact on the glaciers. They're high in the mountains. They're not only far south, but also very high in the mountains. Yes, they found a lot of black carbon in those glaciers from these fires because they were already studying that the melting of those glaciers up in Bolivia. They could clearly show in the record that this carbon. So that's why we start talking of the Amazonia as a source of contamination, as a source of carbon for the world, which is worrying because a lot of conservation efforts rely on the Amazon being a source, a sink, a carbon sink. So a lot of big companies China, Europe, even here, they contaminate a lot. They generate a lot of carbon, but they say, hey, don't worry, we're paying people in the Amazonia so they have a piece of land that they don't let anyone to get in and to protect. So we're doing some contamination here, but we're protecting there. Well, that it seems that it makes no sense right now if Amazonia is not being the carbon sink we all want to see. Listo. What is the other problem we're having right now? All these are based on models, mathematical models, computational models, algorithms that they've been doing for the last 20 years. What they're seeing right now is that all those models didn't take into account climate change. Now that's a big factor, so they are correcting. When they readjust the models with climate change, they see that everything is even worse than we thought. Actually, climate change by itself is now a source of loss of biodiversity. As I told you, we've seen trees that are dying because they don't resist. The trees that are flourishing right now are the trees that are highly resistant to heat and so these guys, what they do is they do models. For example, what will be the impact of deforestation in the next years if we keep the trending deforestation? And then they say, what is the impact only of climate change? And when they put all together, okay, what is gonna happen if we keep these rates of deforestation and then we add the factor of climate change? Is worst, is way worse. Okay, so let's talk more about this Amazonia as a carbon source. More studies, all this year, really. So recent, this is a pretty new concept. So this is different from Nobre. Nobre and Lovejoy, they've been talking about the savanization of Amazonia for almost 5 years now. It's incredible. They publish each year an editorial in the Nature magazine. They just did this December 2019. You can see that every year is worse than what they predict. And that's important because a lot of people say, oh, those models, they're always so catastrophic, they're predicting things that never happen. Well, every year these guys are telling us, hey, we said in 2016 this is gonna happen. Now this is gonna happen faster than we thought. Listo. Wildfires. When we mix deforestation, climate change, and defaunation, we're gonna have more wildfires, more frequent, and they're gonna cover more area. And then we're gonna have you see, this is even another author in another recent paper in another important journal saying the Amazon is not anymore a carbon sink. We're getting into a carbon source. The conclusions, we used to think we need to stop deforestation, we need to protect, we need to stop deforestation, we need to protect. No. What they're saying right now is that is not gonna work. Deforestation by itself with the right rates of fires, that is not gonna work anymore. We need to rebuild. You say there. No, this is the next one. Now everyone is saying we need to rebuild the forest. We need not only to protect, but help him repeat. So what is gonna happen with all this loss of forest? Why should we protect? A lot of people say, okay, whatever, the Amazonia, they can die, all of those animals, whatever, we don't care. I mean, it's about us, it's not about, we need to start seeing nature as part of our wellness, even. The source of air, the source of water is our own wellness, and it's our human well-being, which is in danger. Okay, yeah, we can lose a lot of species and all that, but the life we're living to our kids and to our people, and the people who live there, actually, they're suffering. Listo. Here, this is the one. The Amazon requires rebuilding. As the underpinning base of the hydrological and carbon cycle of global climate. So it's not enough to protect, it's not enough to no more deforestation, to make these ecotourism programs. No, we need to start rebuilding. That is not happening at all, and it's not gonna happen soon. So next year in the Amazon Week, we'll see what new concepts we're gonna talk about, and I don't know, what do we need? Imagination. I think we really need imagination right now. Nothing else is working. Nothing else. We need new, and that's why we need the new generations to help us think. There are a lot of people doing great things there, great programs. What Ivan just told us about Edgar, that's amazing. I mean, there are hundreds of programs that people from there are using, or people from outside are implementing there. We don't know. We don't have an answer what to do. I think the change has to be more cultural, and it has to happen here, the way we consume, etc. And that's it. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. The pink dolphin. This is another big predator, the pink dolphin, big predator. Oh, we didn't talk about the water, which is worst. Way worse.
Muchísimas gracias, Diego. Thanks so much. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna start with the questions you have, and for whom those questions are gonna be addressed to. You got questions? Yes. Okay. Hold on a second.
For Diego?
The question? Sí. ¿Sí? Yeah. The question is for Diego.
Just go ahead and ask and repeat the question.
Oh, yes.
Have they found what is causing the fungus in the reptiles?
It's natural, totally natural. It's a pandemic. Literally, it's a pandemic that just go out of. There's a lot. There's also related to climate change, it seems, but yeah, it looks like it's not human intervention and has been everywhere. Just a pandemic.
Yes.
Yes.
And what was the name of the scientist that in 1988 made the correlation between the coyote and the birds?
Oh yes, this guy. This guy. And Tunes. Oh no. Where is it? Here. No.
Yeah, that was it.
No. That's not the one.
Hypothesis.
This one. Oh yeah, Sule, yes, Sule. And then yes, 11 years later, we have that problem here. Who likes fishing in the ocean here in so you know the Goliath grouper in Florida, biggest of the groupers. They've been protecting it like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Nobody can get any Goliath grouper. So fishermen are really mad because they say that fish is eating everything because now we cannot fishing. So there are no snappers, there are no smaller groupers because they eat everything. We need to stop that protection and we need to keep fish that killer. Well, it seems that the reefs where we have Goliath groupers are more diverse. There are more snapper. Exactly this, exactly. We keep this, we're gonna have more of this. But we think as a fisherman, okay, let's kill this because it's the opposite. It's not the birds that are dying, it's the fish. So they say, let's kill this and then we're gonna have abundance of this. And it's still a big problem. A lot of fishermen, they say, we need to kill all those, you know the word. Dime, sí.
So you mentioned that like the companies, they do the bad things and then they say they protect by having a patch of land in the
Yes,
Amazon.
bonos de carbono, yes.
So is that like more like who regulates that?
Oh, that's
is that
super.
Just the companies? Is it more of a a bunch of countries policies? Like, is there some control in that, or is that what we're striving for?
There's some control, but in reality, who is controlling that are the same companies. Because you go to one of these governments and they want money, and they say, hey, we have a problem here in China or even here in the United States because we're liberating a lot of carbon. why don't we let us pay for all of that? And then we show here in the United States that we're keeping a sink of carbon there, and we're gonna have huge taxes reduction because of that. And in some places, it's a law. In some places, in Europe, they have to do something. If they're producing, I don't know, so many millimoles of carbon, they will have to look a place who's able to capture the same carbon they're producing and finance. Usually, they are the tropical forests who can supposedly get the more carbon out of the air, supposedly. But that's a mess. That's totally a mess. And that's a lot of corruption. At the end, are the companies who are really managing that. And then they go and throw some money there.
Are there any initiatives that are looking to rebuild or revitalize biodiversity? You mentioned that there's not a lot, but there are also some people doing really good things in the Amazon.
Yes.
What are they? Like,
Madre de Dios, for example, is very important. What they do is young people, they get together and they buy land there. And they buy land, and then there's this place where they're rehabilitating animals that they get from. There's a huge traffic also. We didn't talk right now. For example, aquarium fishes. There's a huge trade, illegal, of aquarium fishes. So they get all the fishes or the animals that have been trading, and they have rehabilitation centers, and they have good results because they don't only protect the area where they sit, but they also helping to repopulate those areas. Yeah, we need more imagination. There's not really, yeah.
is there any ecotourism going on?
Yes, a lot, a lot. Hmm? ¿A dónde?
The reserve.
Oh, Alpaguayo, Pacaya,
They
yes.
turned it into
Yes.
like an event that you can like sign up for and do like the different days to be involved, but it's just like teaching sustainability to the kids and stuff too.
Yes,
which
that's
is
a good
really
point.
important.
Yeah, you can do these trips there, and you can do internships or do a lot of programs with these people. Yes.
What are your thoughts on invasive species?
Oh, yeah, I forgot to talk about it. Huge problem when we're talking about loss of biodiversity. La tilapia. Yes, you know that jungle floods, and then it's dry. During the dry season, they have what they call PC granjas, like fish farming places. And then at some point they were growing tilapia, you know, the fish? And there was a big flood, and all that tilapia went to the rivers and everything, and now they're killing everything. It's a bad problem, the tilapia in Africa, and also plants. We have an aquatic plant that is covering the lakes, and then they get no oxygen. Big problem, invasive species, because yeah, for an invasive species, it's pretty cool to live in the Amazon. Lot of food, it's warm, humid. So yeah, if it doesn't come from the Antarctica, they're probably gonna survive there. They're gonna thrive.
Yeah. Since we're running out of time, Diego, I was thinking about, that this is my question for the audience now, and also for the presenters. What are what common threads and themes can you think about that relate all the presentations?
Storytelling and the importance of imagination into not only realizing what is happening, but seeing a way out. So not giving up to like, Amazon is burning, woe is me, I'm gonna go cry. But it's not just the Amazon, right? It's like in Tallahassee there's also an invasive species. There's this like plant that grows. I go to the trails. I talked to the people there. It was a problem. They started using pesticides, which then became a problem because that runs off into the
water.
The lake. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also the people who are spraying this, they are being affected by that.
Yes.
So it's really important to talk to the people involved, to talk to the people, us who live here, and tell stories to each. Like I have a lot of nieces and nephews. I'm from Honduras, so like our family's huge. and the way that they relate to the environment. Like one time, my little niece just like hugged this tree, and she was like, "Ah, yo amo los árboles, los amo." And I was like, "Oh my God, you're so cute. I love you so much." And when we were getting oranges, she said the tree said not to take them all because there has to be some. Let's go to the other one. And I was like, I didn't even question. I was like, yes, that is what the tree said. So let's just, so it's like this childlike wonder and being around
Yes.
children is.
That's also very important. You see a lot of that there, a lot of those communications, those feelings, that feeling that the things, all the things, the trees, or everything, they have a soul. They're as equal as and important as humans. That's an important thing, like changing the way we see nature as just a provider of services or food, but just like in the same.
Another theme is just like the balance, harmony, homeostasis of everything, because like every single thing is connected, and just with this hypothesis, everything affects something else at some point down the line. Whether it's the people throwing their trash, like Evan's presentation, to yours, everyone's, really shows that connectedness and how important it is to stay at homeostasis, because too much or too little of something throws everything off balance.
Yeah, the interconnectedness.
Yeah.
That is, and all over, right? Amazonia is not an isolated place. It's not an island. Whatever happens to Amazonia happens to us too.
It's the biggest climate controller in the world. So.
I was gonna say, on the flip side, like not only everything that happens in Amazonia happens to us, also everything we do is implicated in the making and unmaking of the Amazon. So like, for example, we're talking about trash and like plastics and pollution in the Amazon. Think about too, like your own habits of consumption and production, how that can impact the world, impact Amazon. And I think that, like for example, are you still using plastic bags? Like, how can you make your life less of an impact on the world? And then too, like on that note, we talked about interconnectedness. I think just the ways we're implicated in all of this, like whether that's as researchers who are going to the region, or people here thinking about these issues, like from one way or another, we are choosing to implicate ourselves in this region, and that could be a good thing and a bad thing. So you need to think like how we're interacting with these themes, what sort of contribution we're making, and like what our positionality is in all of this. So I think all the presentations kind of have this note of everyone here, presenters, attendees, researchers, everybody are implicated in this. So
Yes. Yes. Olguita iba a decir algo.
Sí.
More on the part on the side of what he was saying, that we need to start listening what people who's familiar with the environment we are studying or we are trying to protect or reproduce, what they know about that environment. Because so many times we are trying to impose our perspective on their land, their knowledge, and we are not listening about that previous knowledge that they have on nature, on environment, and that goes a long way. The lack
Absolutely.
of understanding, mutual understanding of these courses, it's making an effect too.
Yes, we're not listening. We haven't been listening, and that's why this is happening. And people who talks and all that, yeah, they even get killed. Yeah, Amazonia have a lot of environmental leaders dying. We're talking hundreds, maybe thousands. Yes, we're not listening. Yep.
It kind of reminds me of the presentation from Monday where we talked about like ecological like consciousness. So just being aware of like things that we're doing and like over the years, like watching the degradation of the environment and not treating like issues like these as issues of like the future, but things that are happening like right now and things that need to be taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have a lot of hope in the new generation. I hope it's not like my generation.
I was just gonna say that it's the theme of like life doesn't end when our life ends, but rather that like it's a continuous circle that we need to work on. Or like the idea that like, well, why should we care if like this frog exists, it's not affecting me, but like the idea that like our children and then the children of our children, like I feel like that's something that has helped me also change my habits, because if I view the world as like
never ending, like this constant, like, you get me? It
Mhm.
makes me like more, like hold myself to a higher standard. So like that idea is something that I saw in like every presentation.
Yes.
Well, I think that we can wrap this up. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation, these dialogues. Keith, you had a question? I'm sorry. No.
Just kind of building on what everyone else, the common theme of the need for change, but at the same time, it's almost like we don't quite know what to do. And I mean, I remember your presentation from last year, Diego, and your dissertation about learning new techniques, learning new ways of thinking about the environment from indigenous cultures, right? But but is that also kind of like is that possible? I mean,
I guess
It doesn't seem-
what we learn from them is like an attitude, more than in specific cases, certain techniques of dealing with a particular land, but I think it's mainly a sort of wisdom. Yeah.
But I was struck by the presentation on marketing, because that it's taking the perspective that we need to work within capitalism, rather than this idea of maybe moving beyond capitalism, or going outside of, looking for solutions outside of capitalism. It seems to me like, I mean, is that even possible without some kind of a revolution, like a whole?
We have economists here. We have
And a
insurance,
marketer.
and we got marketing people. I mean, I don't want to keep you here, but you just threw something very important. What do you guys think?
Let me touch on that really quickly.
Okay,
So if
all
any
right.
of you guys know what iGEM is, it's like synthetic biology, and FSU has their own iGEM team and stuff. So MIT is what started it, and they're working on a lot of like sustainable, synthetically engineered projects. And so yesterday, my boyfriend works for them, so yesterday he said another iGEM team was just funded $30 million by Bill Gates to develop a microbe that produces palm oil sustainably. And so that's when you think about technology in the future, like not just AI, but the technology of science and coming up with alternative solutions so that we don't have to use nature, we can kind of like develop our own sense of it. And so like, as far as like what do we do, keep supporting the science to come up with alternatives, I guess.
And vote.
Yeah, vote.
And changing our
If you like the environment, they were saying that's the most powerful tool we have
Because
right
it
now.
all is coming from the money. The people who have the money are the ones that are making the big damages. So if you have people that have the money that are for the right reasons, it will make a change.
Bolsonaro in 1 year in Brazil has this, not him particularly, but we have seen more destruction in 1 year than 20 years before, just with one government.
Ivan, you're gonna say something?
Yeah, just kind of on the capitalistic mindset. I think we, especially in this field of research, we put a huge connotation on the word capitalism. We view it kind of evil-like. But I think it's important to understand that it's a system. It doesn't really have a mind of its own. It operates within our own culture. And so I don't think it's necessarily that we, like you said, you can't really go past capitalism. And its baseline definition is a method of distribution for rarities, pretty much. And so what we're dealing with here is, like you said, the mix. And so kind of what I think the next step would be, just kind of as an estimate, I'm not really sure, but it would be to evolve our culture in the way to understand kind of like the animism and the higher context of understanding the knowledge of the trees, the ability to see them as a life form in their own, will allow us to, for lack of a better word, exploit these resources, because they're going to be exploited one way or another, whether it's for ecotourism, whether it's for an Instagram feed where someone goes to the Amazon, they're like, oh man, I'm making a difference, and they're not. It's all these things, so we have to be able to operate within these confounds and maneuver it to where it can be beneficial for that aspect, because we're at this point we're exploiting it with lack of knowledge for longevity wise. So even when they're going down to make money, they're not looking at the whole picture. It would make them a lot more money in the long term to actually treat this well and operate benefactorially. I'm not sure if that's a word, with the people in this area. And I think that's kind of, it's not necessarily a move around capitalism. It's not necessarily separating. It's kind of working with.
And there is also an appropriation of capitalism techniques to protect and conserve. Too.
Right.
And they seem to work. Yeah, I agree. I agree. It's
And
fake,
also,
yeah,
that
but it looks
will-
like they work.
that brings also the you know, the sense of identity, the sense of place of the people who live in that land, because they're gonna see that the source of monetary benefit comes out from the very, very ancient foundations that they have. So that's a possibility. William?
I just wanted to chip in here, kind of in a contradictory perspective to what I'm hearing at the moment. So, from like a historian background and then like having worked in Iquitos for a while, I think it's important to contextualize all of this and what capitalism does mean in the Peruvian Amazon. So we're going to talk about that, like Dr. Aliano's mentioned. I think it might have been yesterday. The rubber boom, for example, which involved the enslavement and genocide of 30,000 indigenous people. You have the legacies of capitalist development are seen all over Iquitos, where you have these ornate colonial buildings next to streets that aren't developed, next to people trying to have their various entrepreneurial ways to survive in a system that isn't really built for them, and one that they were forced into. You have hundreds of towns that were abandoned, that were developed for the rubber boom, and then left to basically rot once they had extracted the rubber that they wanted and left the people there and just like do what you have to survive, but left all support and completely pulled out investment. So I think I would caution against kind of like just glossing over the histories of capitalism in the region. I would definitely critically analyze that. And I think it is important to work within the system we have to improve things and have practical applications for today. But looking at Peruvian Amazon from a historical lens and seeing how capitalism was forcibly implemented in the region and then thinking of how people responded to that throughout the time, I would caution against like saying we shouldn't work to undermine the system as well and have more systemic changes. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's you work today with what you have, meanwhile the whole time working towards a better future. And I think if you take seriously and you want to listen to perspectives of people from the Peruvian Amazon or take seriously the history of the region, I don't think that answer is just like this system works. And I see more hands raised over there as well to get more people's perspective.
Well, I just wanted to make a plug for you back there. Are you from Tallahassee? Do you live here?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I live here, but I'm from Michigan.
Oh, okay. No, I only say that because like on Saturdays the Frenchtown market, there are a lot of my friends like work there. And there's a lot of people from Tallahassee, like local communities, you know, not in the Amazon, not anywhere, but they work with native species here and a lot of agroforestry projects and permaculture, which is like sustainable agriculture. So that's where I get mushrooms, that's where I get color greens, that's where I get grapefruits. I bought like rabbit meat to there too. So it's like, you know, talk about how capitalism can be used for good. That's like a really easy way if you live in Tallahassee. That's my biggest contribution while I'm here, really, because it's the most thing that I could do. And this type of agriculture works a lot with restoring soil health to make it fertile for the species that already live here. So it's not just like agriculture for food. It's kind of the topic what you were saying earlier, rebuilding.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not just like let it like stop doing something. So it's like rebuilding, but also like yielding food products from it. So that's like a really cool thing if you want to check it out. Everybody should check it out. I love the Frenchtown Market. Very community oriented, very place based.
Yes.
Good to know.
Survival of a sense of community in Amazonia. That's for sure. Yeah. Okay. Well. Thank you so much. And I guess my students have some plans that they want to go to continue our conversations in what's the place?
Tin
Lizzie's.
Where?
Tin and Lizzie's. It's on Madison Street. We're gonna drink some margaritas and eat some tacos.
He's like, we are, yeah.
Probably not me. I gotta try.
Yeah, right.
But I'll be there.
Tequila.
Totally. I'll be there. So thank you so much, all of you, for contributing. Exchange of ideas about Amazonia. All right, and knowledge. So